Please, I'm not asking for a handout." Ilara's voice was a fragile thread against the deluge that assaulted the stone courtyard of the Croft estate. A crack of lightning split the sky, illuminating her like a ghost at the wrought iron gate. She shielded her face with a hand, strands of honey blonde hair plastered to her skin. "I just want to work, to clean, to do anything. For a plate of food for my daughter." Inside the heart of his stone fortress, Julian Croft, 37, watched the security monitor, his knuckles white on the edge of the mahogany desk. His gaze locked on the small child huddled against her mother, a splash of color catching his eye. The girl, Calla, wore a bracelet, a small constellation of simple wooden beads, identical to the one he had carved for his own daughter, Lily, in another lifetime. The air evacuated his lungs, the memory a phantom weight on his own wrist. A tremor went through him, an involuntary reflex of a wound that never healed. With a convulsive act, he pressed the button, and the heavy gates groaned open. Ilara stepped through the threshold, clutching Calla's hand, her small frame trembling violently. She pulled her shoulders back, her chin held high, a silent declaration that this was an offer of labor, not a plea for pity. When she finally stood before Julian in the cavernous front hall, his voice was like chips of ice. "State your business." Ilara met his cold gaze, her own eyes a storm of their own. "A meal for my daughter. I am a hard worker. My hands are capable. That's all I ask." She stood there, drenched and defiant. Julian's eyes drifted down to Calla's small, pale face, and for a heart-stopping second, he saw a ghost superimposed over her features. Thunder muttered a low warning through the crystal chandeliers overhead. He finally broke his gaze and stepped aside, his voice suddenly rough with an emotion he refused to name. "Get in. The child needs to be warm." He led them wordlessly down a dimly lit corridor, past portraits of ancestors with cold, judging eyes. He watched as Ilara guided Calla into a guest suite in the quiet East Wing. Then, without another word, Julian turned and retreated up the marble staircase, each step an echo in the vast, silent house that now held a memory he could no longer escape. A short time later, a soft sound drew Ilara's attention. Outside their door, a small, neatly folded bundle had appeared. A child's sweater and trousers, woven from a material so soft it seemed spun from clouds, and tiny, rolled socks. There was no note, only the silent, deliberate offering. Pride warred with necessity in Ilara's heart, but one look at Calla's pale, shivery form made the choice for her. After dressing her daughter in the impossibly soft clothes that smelled of cedar and forgotten childhoods, she ascended the grand, curved staircase to his private study, the cold frame of Lily's photograph a brand against his palm. The image of Calla, so small and fragile in a world that had been so cruel, was a fresh tear in an old wound. Downstairs, Ilara sat on a low stool beside the bed, spooning life-giving warmth into her daughter. Calla sipped the broth, her eyelids heavy. Ilara gently brushed a crumb from her lips and pulled the sweater's collar higher. "Thank you," she breathed, a prayer into the oppressive silence, doubting it would ever reach the matter's master. Above, Julian placed the photograph back on his desk, his face a mask of composure threatening to crack. He stared through the rain-streaked window, past the drowned, ghostly shapes of the lilacs Lily had loved, as the silence in the room filled with everything he'd lost. Calla stirred, a faint murmur escaping her lips before she finally succumbed to a deep, peaceful sleep. For a long moment, Ilara simply watched her, her heart aching with a fierce love. Holding the clothes her daughter now wore, she felt the weight of the gesture. She rose, moving with the quiet grace of a wraith, and slipped into the hallway. Pausing at the threshold of the empty, cavernous hall, she inclined her head in a small, respectful bow. Without looking up, she whispered to the shadows, "Thank you for the sanctuary."
A heavy, listening silence was her only reply. She closed the door with a barely audible click. High above on the landing, a statue carved from shadow and regret, Julian stood, his eyes fixed on the closed door. He pressed a hand to the cool, smooth wood of the banister, anchoring himself against a tide of memory.
Ilara collected the empty bowl, careful not to make a sound. She slipped back into the corridor, pausing where a sliver of moonlight sliced through a tall, stained glass window, painting her in hues of sapphire and ruby. Through the grand doors at the end of the hall, she could see the gates, still agape, an invitation back into the howling storm. But she would not take it. She would not return to the chaos. Not tonight. In the solitude of his study, Julian closed his eyes. The cool glass of the framed photograph, a poor substitute for warmth against his chest. Lily's laughter, a sound he hadn't truly heard in years, echoed in the cathedral-like silence of his memory. Bright, unguarded, irreplaceable. He placed the frame back on the desk with reverence and knelt before a wooden chest that sat like a forgotten relic. Lifting the heavy lid, he revealed its single treasure, Lily's bracelet, a perfect twin to the one Calla now wore. He ran a trembling finger over the beads, as if trying to read a forgotten story in their smooth surfaces. A single, broken thought formed in the ruins of his composure. They never said you would come back like this. The great house, a mausoleum of memory, settled around him. He rose and walked to the interior balcony that overlooked the foyer, surveying his silent kingdom. Somewhere in the east wing, Ilara and Calla slept. As the rain continued its relentless assault on the glass, he felt a tectonic shift deep within him, a painful crack between the solid wall of his grief and a fragile, terrifying ray of hope, broken open by a mother's plea and a child's simple bracelet. 2 days had passed in a fragile ecosystem of silence. The sharp, clean scent of lemon polish now mingled with the lingering petrichor from the storm. Ilara moved quietly through the grand hall, a soft rag in hand, tracing the ornate carvings of the banister. It was part of their silent pact. She had not asked to stay, and he had not asked her to leave. She would simply work, making herself useful, earning their sanctuary one polished surface at a time. Nearby, Calla sat on the thick rug, playing with a humble cloth doll Ilara had sewn from an old shirt. The child's cheeks, once so gaunt, now held a healthy, rosy tint, and her eyes, clear and bright, followed her mother's every move. The quiet of the great hall was broken only by the soft whisper of the rag against the wood. When Julian entered the foyer, his steps muted on the marble, Calla looked up, her head tilting with the artless curiosity of a child. She tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mommy," her whisper was a tiny dart in the vast space. "It's the man with the sad voice." Ilara turned, mortified, her hand flying to her mouth. Julian froze mid-stride, the innocent observation striking him with the force of a physical blow. I'm so sorry," Ilara stammered, her words a frantic rush to mend the breach. "She's just a child. She didn't mean anything by it. She notices things." Ilara's voice faded into the vastness of the hall. Julian's stoic expression did not change, but for the first time, A flicker of something unreadable stirred in his dark eyes. His gaze remained on Calla, a long, searching look. "They see what we try to hide," he said, his voice low, almost a confession. Then, turning abruptly, he moved past them and vanished into the heavy doors of the library, his fortress of solitude. That night, with Calla lost in a sea of white linens in a guest bed far too large for her, Elara sat on the rug in the warm pool of a bedside lamp, mending a tear in her daughter's only jacket. The rhythmic pass of the needle was a soothing, familiar motion in a world that had become terrifyingly strange. There was a surreal quality to it sitting here, warm and safe, the scent of old books and lemon polish in the air. A mere 3 weeks ago, their world had been the cramped, cold interior of a van. The memory was sharp and bitter. The metallic tang of rust, the thin walls that offered little defense against the biting wind as the first frost of the season claimed their engine. With no job, no savings, and no one to call, she had wrapped Calla in every layer they owned, singing lullabies to drown out the lonely drone of passing trucks on the highway. It had been their lowest point, lower than leaving her nursing career after a supervisor's cloying smile and lingering gaze became unbearable, and the hospital administration met her complaint with a wall of quiet indifference, lower, even, than the day Calla's father had walked out. The slam of their apartment door, a final, echoing crack that had severed their life together without a single look back. Elara hadn't cried then, her jaw set in a hard line of survival. But now, in the stunning, silent comfort of this stranger's home, her eyes burned with something hot and unfamiliar. It was relief, so potent it felt like a sin, tangled with the guilt of accepting a kindness she felt she hadn't earned. When she finally slipped into the bed beside Calla, pulling the heavy, soft blanket over them both, her gaze fell upon the knitstand. A small, polished silver tray sat there, holding a porcelain cup of milk and 3 shortbread cookies. Steam from the milk curled in the lamplight like a phantom's breath. Her heart gave a complicated little jump, a flutter of gratitude tangled with the unease of being watched over by a ghost. She picked up the cup. It was still warm. She looked toward the door, securely closed, and wondered about the man with the sad voice. The next morning, the vast kitchen was filled with the scent of coffee and the soft scratch of crayon on paper. Elara swept the marble floor while Calla sat at the breakfast nook, happily coloring with a set of well-worn crayons that had appeared on the counter. Like all his other offerings, they were silent, unsigned, and perfectly timed. Julian himself materialized for only a moment, a ghost in his own home, nodding briefly at them before disappearing down a hall, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice a low murmur of business. Later, as Elara tucked Calla in for her nap, the little girl's voice was soft with sleep. "Mommy, he looks at you like he's thinking of something sad too." Elara stilled, her hand hovering over Calla's hair. It was the second time her daughter's innocent perception had struck a nerve, and a shiver of unease traced its way down her spine. She smoothed the child's curls and retreated to a chair in the corner, a simple question leaving her with no answer. That evening, as twilight bled across the manicured lawns, Elara stood by the kitchen window and wrestled with her own thoughts. She was profoundly grateful, but a lifetime of hardship had taught her to be wary. People with this kind of wealth and power didn't act without reason. She feared the unseen strings, the inevitable price for this sanctuary. He had not asked for anything, not even her last name. She was a ghost here too, an anonymous woman living in the heart of a stranger's world. Upstairs, Julian sat in his study, the only light coming from the flickering heart of the fireplace. His fingers traced the familiar grooves of Lily's beaded bracelet on his desk, the perfect twin to the one Calla wore. A sound drifted up the grand staircase, Calla's laughter from the kitchen. It was so alien in the oppressive silence it felt like a physical touch, a ripple across a long, stagnant pool. He closed his eyes. In that breath, he didn't just remember Lily. He felt her, the weight of a small hand in his, the scent of her shampoo, the impossible brightness of her smile. It was the ghost of a feeling he thought long dead. Not fatherhood, not anymore, but something adjacent to it, an echo, a possibility. For years, the Croft estate had been a mausoleum, a monument to what he had lost, its silence thick, unyielding, and patient. Every corridor and grand room echoed with memories of the girl who once was. But Calla's laughter was different. It was not a memory. It was the first sound of life in a tomb. 4 years. It had been 4 years since the accident that had cleaved his life in two. Julian stood at the threshold of the upstairs nursery, his hand gripping the doorframe so tightly his knuckles were white. He rarely came here. This room was a shrine, a perfectly preserved moment in time. The walls, still a soft, hopeful lilac, held fading murals of clouds and birds. Her bookshelf was untouched, the stuffed animals on her bed frozen mid-slumber, their glass eyes staring into a forever afternoon. Lily had been 7, a whirlwind of curiosity and sweetness with a fierce, wild affection for the purple orchids that grew in the conservatory. She drew them constantly, their impossible violet hue appearing on napkins, receipts, and once, in a fit of inspiration, on the wall behind her bed. One of those drawings, a smudged and crookedly taped piece of paper, remained on the stainless steel refrigerator door downstairs, a sacred ghostly relic he could not bring himself to touch. The day she died, he was trapped in a metal tube at 30,000 feet, hurtling toward London to finalize a deal that now meant nothing. The call had come from his ex-wife, her voice splintered with a frantic grief that shattered his world through the tinny speaker of the airplane phone. "I thought you knew she was with me," she'd sobbed, the words a confession of a fatal miscommunication. He hadn't known. He hadn't been there. He never said goodbye. That was the unhealing wound. Since then, he had buried himself in a fortress of work. Acquisitions, reports, numbers, they were predictable. They didn't betray you. Spreadsheets didn't die. He had built an empire atop his silence. It was safer that way. But now, the sound of Calla's life was seeping through the cracks. That morning, as Julian reviewed documents, he heard the soft, rhythmic sounds of Alara cleaning upstairs. He let it be. She was always careful, respectful of the space. But then he heard a sound that made his blood run cold, the slow, sacrilegious groan of the nursery door. His pulse hammered in his ears. By the time he reached the top of the stairs, he saw her. Alara was standing in the center of the room, in the middle of his shrine, holding a small, pale blue pillow. The fabric was torn at the seam, a clump of white stuffing exposed like a wound. It was a desecration. The quiet tolerance he had harbored for days vanished, replaced by a surge of raw, protective fury. His voice, when it came, was a blade of ice. "What are you doing in here?" Alara jumped, spinning around, her eyes wide with shock. I'm sorry," she stammered, placing the pillow on the bed as if it were made of spun glass. The air was thick with his fury. "It was torn. I only thought I could mend it. You should not be in here, he said, and the soft tolerance was gone, his voice a steel door slamming shut between them. Ilara bowed her head, shame and regret washing over her. I know. I am truly sorry. I never meant to intrude. He didn't answer, turning on his heel and leaving her alone in the hallowed silence. The ghosts of the room her only accusers. That night, drawn by a force he couldn't name, Julian returned to the nursery. The pillow was back in its place on the small white bed, the torn seam now closed with a line of stitches so small. Even and impossibly neat, it was clear it was an act of quiet penance. A small, folded note lay beside it. His hands trembled as he opened it. I am so sorry. I saw something broken and only meant to fix it. I never meant to disturb a memory. Ilara. He sank to the floor, his back against the wall, pulling the small pillow into his lap. He buried his face in it, inhaling the faintest, lingering scent of Lily's lavender shampoo. And there, in the silent witness of the lilac room, the dam of 4 years finally broke. Tears, hot and silent, a quiet surrender to a grief he had held at bay for so long. Downstairs, Ilara paced the kitchen floor, her heart a tangled knot of anxiety. She had overstepped. But the look in Julian's eyes as he'd found her hadn't been simple anger. It had been the raw, cornered look of an animal in pain, a mask for a wound so deep it had hollowed him out. She saw him for what he was, a man who had built a fortress around his own heart and lost the key. The next morning, he appeared at the kitchen threshold as she poured Kala a bowl of cereal. He looked exhausted, but somehow lighter. I have other rooms that could use tending to, he said, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder. If you would be willing to stay another week. Ilara looked up, surprised by the hesitant offer. Of course, she said softly. Thank you. He gave a slight jerky nod, more to himself than to her. It's easier, he added, the admission costing him. Having someone, her laughter. It makes the silence bearable. A quiet understanding passed between them, a recognition of the language of loss he was speaking. And though neither said it aloud, something shifted in that moment. It was not a pact of debt or charity, but a fragile agreement of healing halting, hesitant, but undeniably beginning. The piece shattered with a single, vicious headline. It appeared first on a gossip blog, written in a cheap font over a grainy, long-lens photo of Ilara in the garden with Kala. The Croft captive? Billionaire recluse Julian Croft's mystery woman revealed. By morning, the story had ignited a digital feeding frenzy. The grand front gate of the Croft estate was no longer an entrance but a barricade, swarmed by a pack of reporters. Ilara watched in horror from behind the living room curtains as microphones were shoved through the iron bars. Vicious, strobing flashes flickered like hostile lightning. Is it true she was living in a van? Did she trap you, Mr. Croft? Is the child yours? Kala whimpered at the cacophony, and Ilara pulled her close, shielding her from the chaos. Julian, his face a mask of calm, cold fury, moved past her toward the front door. Stay here, he commanded softly. He stepped out onto the porch, and his voice, low and resonant, cut through the noise like a surgeon's scalpel. This woman, he began, his eyes sweeping the crowd with contempt, and her child have brought more life into this house than it has seen in years. She is the reason this house remembers what hope sounds like. He took a step forward. And if I read the words gold digger or charity case next to her name again, I will personally fund the dismantling of every publication you work for. Is that clear?" The press froze, stunned into silence. Inside, Elara sat on the floor, her own world upended twice in one day. She had not expected him to defend her so publicly, so fiercely. She had seen the recluse, the grieving father, the quiet benefactor. Now, she had seen the lion. That afternoon, long after the press had retreated, a sleek black car bypassed the lingering photographers with an air of practiced immunity. A man in a tailored suit strode through the kitchen as if he owned it, stopped in front of Julian and raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. It was Marcus Vance, Julian's oldest friend and the only person who had dared to keep breaking through his walls over the years. Well, Marcus said, a wry smirk playing on his lips. "Looks like you finally rejoined the land of the living. I was beginning to wonder. You look different," Marcus said, leaning against the doorframe of the study, a smirk on his face. Julian looked up from the fire. "That bad?" "No," Marcus said, his expression softening. "That alive." They sat for a long time, the fire crackling quietly between them. Marcus glanced at the open notebook on the desk, filled with childish drawings of orchids. "So she did it," he said softly. "She got through." Julian let out a long breath he seemed to have been holding for years. "I didn't plan for any of this, Marcus. I let them in that night thinking it was for a meal, a single night's shelter." His gaze drifted toward the window. "But now, Calla laughs, and I swear I can hear Lily in the echo. Elara looks at me, and she doesn't see the broken pieces. And God help me, I want to be the man she sees." Marcus leaned back, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Then be him," he said simply. "Lily is gone, Julian. But you're not. You get to choose right now if her memory is going to be your anchor or your wings." Julian stared into the fire, the words settling deep in his soul. Then, for the first time, he nodded, not in grief, but in decision. Later that evening, while Calla slept and the house grew quiet again, he found Elara in the laundry room, folding a small mountain of Calla's clothes. He hesitated at the door, then stepped inside, holding a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth with time and care. "I wanted to give you this." He handed it to her. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a thin, well-loved book. The cover was soft with age, a different title from the one in her story, almost rubbed away, The Adventures of the Whispering Hedgehog. "It was Lily's favorite," he said, his voice thick with memory. "She made me read it to her every single night, long after she knew all the words by heart." Elara traced the worn spine with a delicate finger. "She would have loved that story you told about the hedgehog who wanted to fly. I wanted you to have it because—" He paused, searching for the right words. "This book. This was the sound of peace in our house. And you've brought that back, Elara. You and Calla. You've brought back the peace." Elara looked up from the book, her eyes warm but shadowed with an old uncertainty. "Sometimes I wonder," she whispered, the words so quiet he had to lean in to hear them, "if I'm just a replacement for the life you lost." His expression softened, all the walls gone. "Elara, no." He waited until she met his gaze. "You're not a replacement. You're a reminder." She looked confused, and he clarified, his voice full of a conviction that sealed the cracks in his own heart. "You remind me of what love is supposed to look like. how strong it is, how it fights and protects and never, ever gives up. He took a small step closer. Lily's memory is what was. You are what is. And for the first time in a very long time, he said, his eyes full of gratitude, admiration, and something more fragile, I'm thinking about what could be. As she closed the lid of the small wooden box, her hand brushed his. The touch was brief, a flicker of warmth, but it was enough. An unspoken current passed between them, an acknowledgement of the fragile hope that now lived in the space they shared. She gave him a small, cautious smile, a fragile, beautiful thing, and in the quiet of the great house, something new had taken root. Weeks later, the sun filtered through the branches of the old willow tree, casting soft, dancing shadows on the lawn. The garden, once a landscape of ghosts, was now a place of laughter and light. A checkered picnic blanket was stretched beneath a large oak, dotted with sandwich crumbs and plastic cups of lemonade. Calla's delighted shrieks filled the air as she chased shimmering bubbles across the grass, her small feet wobbling with joy. Ilara sat on the blanket, barefoot and serene, watching her daughter. Julian sat a few feet away, cross-legged, watching them both. He had always despised picnics, viewing them as hollow performances of happiness for other families. But this, the gentle breeze, the chaotic joy of a toddler, the quiet companionship of a woman who had seen the worst of him and stayed, this was beautifully, messily real. It filled his chest with a pleasant ache, the feeling of a heart learning to stretch again. "Careful, my love," Ilara called out as Calla darted toward the old stone path. But the warning came a moment too late. Her daughter's foot caught on an uneven stone, and she fell with a sharp, startled cry, her small hand scraping against the rough surface. Ilara was on her feet in an instant, her heart racing, but Julian was faster. It was pure instinct, a muscle memory of fatherhood he thought he had buried. He reached Calla in 2 long strides, scooping her sobbing form into his arms with a practiced gentleness. "Hey, it's okay, sweetheart. I've got you," he murmured, rocking her as he brushed the dirt from her knees. And then it happened. As her cries began to subside into hiccuping breaths, Calla clung to the front of his shirt, looked up at him with tear-filled eyes, and uttered a single hiccuping, tear-soaked word. "Daddy." Time stopped. The birdsong, the breeze, the very air seemed to freeze. The world narrowed to that one impossible word. Julian's heart seized in his chest, a fist of love and memory and terror all at once. He stood paralyzed in the sunlit garden, holding the child who was not his, caught between the ghost of the father he had been and the man this little girl believed him to be. Ilara, halfway toward them, froze. For a single, suspended moment, no one moved. The world silent save for Calla's soft sniffles as she buried her face in Julian's neck. He did not rise. Instead, he slowly sank to his knees on the grass, holding her small, trembling body close. His arms tightened instinctively, protectively, and then, without warning, the tears he had held back for 4 long years finally came. He did not sob. He simply wept, a quiet, profound release for what he was so terrified he might find again. Ilara knelt beside them, her own eyes shining, and placed a gentle hand on his arm. She's never called anyone that before," she whispered. Julian looked up, his gaze meeting hers over Calla's head, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't expect to feel this again." "Julian," Ilara said, her voice steady and clear, "I have to ask you, Do you want this to be a part of our life? Not as a ghost or a benefactor, but as a man building a future with us." He looked at her, the woman who had wandered into his fortress of grief and dismantled it with quiet strength, and he did not hesitate. "I do." Later that evening, as the house settled into its peaceful rhythm, Elara found a single flower resting on her knitstand. It was a perfect purple orchid, the impossible violet of a twilight sky. There was no note, no explanation, but she knew. It wasn't a memory of Lily, it was a promise for her. Julian watched her from the hallway as she found it, and when she looked up, their shared gaze was a silent conversation that answered every question. That night, after Calla had fallen asleep, curled around the well-loved hedgehog from her storybook, Julian sat across from Elara in the living room. The fire cast a low, intimate glow. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "This is your home now, Elara," he said, his voice firm with a certainty that had been absent for years. "If you'll have it." She let out a shaky breath, a wave of relief so potent it almost brought her to tears. "And what happens," she asked, voicing the last shadow of doubt, "when the world comes knocking again? When they want to know who I am to you?" Julian looked into her eyes, his expression finally completely open and unguarded. "Let them ask," he said, his grip tightening on her hand. "They will know you are the woman who walked into a house full of ghosts and taught it how to breathe again." He paused, his heart in his eyes. "They will know you are the woman I love, and if it takes a lifetime to tell the world our story," Julian said, his voice low and sure, "then that's what we'll take." Elara looked at him, her smile no longer cautious, but full of a light he was beginning to recognize as his own personal sunrise. "A lifetime sounds perfect," she whispered. Outside, the garden glowed in the last light of day. Inside the great house, in the space between grief and grace, a new life had irrevocably taken root. Autumn turned to winter, and winter thawed into a hopeful spring. The Croft estate no longer felt like a fortress. Over the months, it had softened, breathing with a new rhythm. The walls, once echoing with a profound silence, now hummed with life, the scent of baking bread from the kitchen, the melody of a forgotten piano being played with gentle hands, and Calla's laughter, which had become the house's true heartbeat. On a bright Tuesday morning, Elara stood by the front door, tying the laces on her sneakers. Her hair was pulled into a neat, practical bun, and a small stack of textbooks was tucked under one arm. She looked back over her shoulder at Julian, who leaned against the doorframe, a comfortable, steady anchor in her new world, sipping his morning coffee. "Orientation for the nursing program starts at 10, she said, her voice laced with a nervous excitement. "You will be brilliant," he replied, reaching out to smooth a stray piece of hair from her temple. "They're lucky to have you." She smiled, stood on her toes, and gave him a quick, confident kiss. As she stepped outside into the morning sun, Calla ran after her, a backpack bouncing on her small shoulders, her arm held out. "Wait, Mama." "You forgot your lucky pen." Elara laughed, a sound as bright as the day, and scooped her daughter up, twirling her in the air. Julian watched them from the porch, his heart full with a quiet, profound gratitude that felt like sunlight spreading through his veins. Just months ago, none of this had seemed possible. Elara's dream of returning to the career she loved, Calla's open, fearless joy, and him standing here, a willing witness to it all. Here they were, weaving a new life, one precious thread at a time. Inside, the living room had changed too. Gone were the stiff, formal arrangements and the untouched, museum-like corners. In their place stood a child's play tent, a bookshelf overflowing with colorful stories. And, hanging in a simple frame in the center of the main wall, a new piece of art. It was Cala's masterpiece, rendered in crayon and watercolor on thick paper. 3 figures holding hands beneath a bright blue sky, one tall, one in a pretty dress, and one very small with wild, curly hair. And above them all, a brilliant, benevolent sun smiled down upon their world. Cala's drawing, the one she'd titled Family in bold, joyful letters, now hung in a simple wooden frame in the main hall. Julian had hung it there himself one afternoon. Ilara had found him staring at it, and when she stood beside him, her hand brushed his as she whispered, "Thank you." He had simply squeezed her hand in reply. On a rainy afternoon months later, they sat together under a large patio umbrella in the garden, shielded from the soft, steady drizzle. Cala, now fearless and full of life, danced barefoot on the wet stones, tipping her head back to let the raindrops kiss her cheeks. Julian reached over, brushing a damp strand of hair from Ilara's face. "I used to dread the rain," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper above the gentle drumming. "It always felt like an ending." She looked at him, and he watched Cala spin in circles, her arms out like wings. "And now," he finished, "it feels like a second chance." Ilara rested her head on his shoulder, her heart full. "I spent so many years fearing the next goodbye," she confessed. "Now, because of you, I believe in tomorrows again." Later that evening, after dinner, Cala crawled onto Julian's lap. She was cradling a photo album, one Ilara had lovingly put together from thrift shop finds and countless new pictures, determined to give Cala a history that began with joy. "Tell me again," she said, her small finger pointing to a photo of them at the zoo. Julian smiled. "That was your first day seeing the monkeys. You fed the goats by hand, and you shrieked when one of them licked your palm." She giggled, burying her face in his chest. "You're the best daddy," she mumbled into his shirt. He closed his eyes, holding her tight, the words a perfect healing balm. "I had the best teacher," he thought. That night, after Cala had been tucked in, Julian walked through the garden alone. The flowers Ilara had planted bloomed in a riot of color, even in the moonlight. Among them, he had planted a small special cluster of purple orchids. He paused by them, kneeling down, his fingers gently grazing the velvety petals. "Hi, Lily," he said softly to the quiet air. "I hope you like what we've done with the garden. Ilara planted the roses. I think you would have liked her. She tells the best stories." He stood slowly, feeling a weight he hadn't even realized was still there, lift just a little more than the day before. It was grief, finally transformed into simple, quiet memory. When he returned to the house, it was glowing, a beacon of warmth against the night. And Ilara was waiting for him at the door, barefoot, her face illuminated by the soft light from within. She didn't speak. She simply smiled and reached for his hand.